Okay, so this is my old outfeed table. It unclipped from the back of the saw because sometimes in the old space I had to move the saw around, and this worked. But it was always a little small, so we're going to upscale it today and try to make it a little bit nicer. And this is some hard maple that's rough sawn. It's 4/4, and I got it for 40 cents a board foot. So I'm milling that down, and I'm going to use that for the frame of the outfeed table. The legs and the stretchers for the entire frame of the assembly will be made from this hard maple. The rest will primarily be plywood and sheet goods. After I got it all glued up, I milled it back down to its final dimension. And this is the top of the leg. There'll be a mortise cut into this, and then the top rail, and then also the lower rail, will have a tenon cut on it that will fit into this mortise. And then once I got my router set up, this is a 3/8 carbide router bit, I went ahead and just methodically went through that about 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch at a time and worked my way down, and now I have a very clean mortise. So then I just repeated that 15 more times, and all my mortises were done. Then I moved on to installing the leveling feet pegs into the bottom of this. It'll be far easier to do this now than when I have this glued up and need to flip the whole framework over. I'm using a tool used for lathe work, actually, a center finder, which worked perfectly for this. So now that I have center marked, I can go ahead and use a Forstner bit to countersink this just a little bit. And then I'll drill out the hole afterward to facilitate the post that goes in there. I'm going to pound the threaded insert in, and I'll do that 3 more times, and the legs are done. Then I went back to the table saw, and I inserted a dado stack. My dado stack, I really need a new one. It doesn't cut very flat bottoms, but it's going to have to do. I spent some time just sneaking up on this fit very carefully, not to overdo this, because once you take the wood off, we all know you can't put it back. But as you can see now, if I just cut the shoulders off this tenon, it should work perfectly. Alright, I got all those tenons cleaned up and rounded over and ready. They're fitted and they fit very nicely. Some of them a little tiny bit loose, but it'll have to do. Anyhow, these are the legs, and I'm going to give them just a little bit of character by putting a chamfer along the midsection on 3 of the outside corners. So then it was time to put the whole thing together and make sure everything lined up properly. It was the correct height, and everything just lined up like it was supposed to be. After I double checked and everything was as it should be, I went ahead and decided to start the glue up. I'm just doing the 2 end sections because I don't need the whole glue up in one big shot. That'll kind of make things a little less intimidating. And if you notice the top of the post on the right there, yeah, that's right, I did accidentally start to drill the foot on the wrong end of the leg, but we're going to pretend like you didn't see that, and no one will ever see it because, well, it'll be covered up. Once I got that side glued up, I did the same to the other side, and I was very careful putting a square on it during the glue up and making sure that everything was actually square. And now it's the next day, and I have all the thing kind of loosely put back together, and I'm using the frame as a table. I'm cutting this plywood on top of it, and even though it looks like I'm cutting through the top of my table, there's some styrofoam under here, and I'm not hitting the actual frame. And now what that piece is actually the base, the floor of the base of the unit. I want to cut that now because I'm going to use that to make sure this thing's squared up. I know when I cut this thing, I'll have good square edges on it, and I'll be able to set it in the bottom, and that'll help line everything up very nicely during this bigger glue up. Then because the legs impede into a little bit into the square in the bottom, I need to notch out the corners with a jigsaw. If you look down here, at the base on all those lower rails, I put a 3/4 inch piece of plywood that's glued and stapled in place, and that's going to act as a shelf to hold this lower piece. It's exactly 3/4 of an inch below, so that the floor of this is flush with the rails. We're going to say that this fit on the first try. we're going to go with that, but I might have had to take this back to the table saw a couple times to make it fit. After that, it was time for the main glue up. I had a little struggle because I was doing this by myself, and I actually only had one clamp that was long enough for this glue up. The other side, I used two pipe clamps kind of pieced together, which was a little awkward. And at the top, I got a little creative, and I used two ratchet straps, which actually worked surprisingly well. After that was dry, I popped out that lower piece, and then I glued that down and stapled it in and then clamped it because the rails had just a very slight bow in them. And now, just to keep that floor from sagging, I'm sticking some supports on the bottom. They're about 2.5 inch wide pieces of plywood that are glued and pocket hole screwed in. And then I added one support in the top. It's probably unnecessary because of the construction of the surface that I'm going to be using, but I put it in there anyhow. And now this is 3/4 inch MDF. I should have used plywood maybe, but it's what I had. I actually got this sheet out of the scratch and dent pile at Menards. It was $12.69. I'm always looking for a good deal. But this is going to be the underlay essentially that meets the table. I'm going to do sort of a framework design, and the table top is going to be about 4 inches thick in the end. So with that cut to size, I went ahead and used some spacer blocks to make sure I got this lined up perfectly even. And then I used tapered countersink and pre-drilled all these holes. But then I ended up using pocket hole screws just to get a little more holding power from having a flat head holding this MDF down to the frame. Hopefully that'll really secure this on there. And this sheet of plywood is what I'll be using for the surface. It's actually called Tiger Form. I got it from Menards. It's actually concrete forming plywood, and it's got a phenolic finish on it. It's not super durable, but it's made to not allow things to really stick to it. And plus I can wax it, and hopefully as things come off the table saw, it'll glide very nicely onto it. And after I got this thing trimmed down to size, I wanted to show you that this is actually fairly decent plywood. There's no voids whatsoever in it. And then I cut this perimeter rail that goes around the entire thing. Like I said, the top's going to be 4 inches thick, and it's sort of a box design. I'm trying to ensure that this thing stays flat. I also cut a rabbet into this piece because that's going to go over that MDF base and cover that up so you don't see the edge of the MDF. And now to attach these side rails to the surface, I'm going to be using pocket hole screws. And because I don't trust those entirely, I want to glue this as well. But glue won't stick to this phenolic surface. So I'm going to cut a very, very shallow rabbet on the bottom of this so that I clear off that surface to expose wood so I can glue the sides along with pocket hole screws to really sure this joint up. I did the same on all four sides, and then I drilled all my pocket holes, and it's time to just glue this thing up. Once I got it all glued up, it was time to flip this over and see if I actually got my measurements correct. So then it was the moment of truth, and I flipped it over very carefully not to crack anything or chip any of the corners. And I don't know if you can tell, but that is a very satisfying fit. It just slid down on there perfectly with a pretty airtight seal. And now about 2 hours later, I have a whole mess of supports under here. Paying a lot of attention to around the perimeter in case I want to clamp anything down. I really want that secure. If you look at the door in the background, not only is it dark outside, it's about 11:30 or 12 at night. When I'm in the middle of a project, I just don't know when to quit. But I'm flipping this over, hopefully for the last time, and tomorrow I'll come back and start sticking some screws in from the underside to secure this down. And the next morning, that's what I did. I put a whole pile of screws in from the underside, and I got that cookie all screwed together. I don't care for the raw wood on the perimeter of this thing, so I'm going to paint that black for now. I may wrap this in some hardwood to give a little more durability at some point, but that's a conversation for another time. And now it's time to move it into position, and I wondered why I didn't build it behind the saw in the first place, because this is really big and extremely heavy to move by myself, and plus everything's in the way. I really didn't think that part through, but moving machines around and getting them out of the way, and a lot of grunting and groaning, but I managed to scoot it over there by myself. And then just now, finally, once I moved it, I realized a big oversight. This angle-iron support on the back that keeps the extension table level with the saw is definitely in the way, and I've got to figure out a workaround on this. And that workaround was this. The solution was to route a slot down into this deep enough to facilitate that angle iron going into it. I sacrificed a router bit when I hit a screw, but eventually I did get it done. And then it was just a matter of moving it into place. Luckily, I have just enough wiggle room in that slot where I was able to raise the leveling feet and get this thing leveled up with the table very nicely. And now one of the last things to do is to route out the miter slots to extend past the table saw. I set up a couple boards to act as fences, and I'll use a flush trim bit to try and route these out. The first one went off without a hitch, but the second one, well, not so much. Wait for it. Yeah, that's not good. We're going to pretend that just didn't happen and just move on. And believe it or not, that carbide router bit handled that very well, and it did not get destroyed. I went back in with a die grinder after the fact and got the screw out of the way and then finished it. Oh my goodness, this thing is heavy, but I guess it won't be moving around. Anyhow, that is the first stage of this. I'm happy with how it turned out. It's a very sturdy surface and it should not flex any. And the biggest thing is it'll provide a great big service for an outfeed for the table saw. In the next video I'll be putting out in a week or so here, I'm enclosing the entire bottom with cabinetry. That'll be the next video. Hey, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.